So we kind of take it for granted today that the Pope is the ultimate authority in appointing bishops, but this was not always entirely clear in the Latin West, at least in practice. As I stated in my previous video, a major problem in medieval states was the tendency for territories and offices to become hereditary. So, an important counterbalance to this was to use the church. Since its prelates were, at least theoretically, celibate, they had no heirs that they could pass their lands to. Moreover, the church always came with a kind of inbuilt and ready-made institutional hierarchy of highly literate individuals, which added to their value as administrators. For this reason, it was common for rulers to endow the church with lands, to be filled by their loyal dependents, and which, with any luck, would revert to the crown on the death of the incumbent. These lands were often still considered integral parts of the crown lands. Moreover, since these were high-status, non-hereditary positions, they were an infinitely recyclable source of sinecures and appanages for younger sons and favorites, who might otherwise be dissatisfied with their allotment and rebel. Naturally, however, this led to an emphasis on the political aspects of the office of bishop, rather than its spiritual mission, and simony, the buying and selling of church offices, became very widespread. So, in the Holy Roman Empire, in this period, starting in the 10th century especially, the king of Germany, and who would then be crowned emperor, generally presented the bishop or cleric with a staff and the local archbishop with a ring, though it wasn't exactly clear which objects symbolized what function, spiritual or secular, which is emblematic of the general difficulty in disentangling the religious aspects of the office from the secular, especially in an age where most laws and functions were not encoded in writing. Now, the emperor was not against this confusion, and it allowed him to cultivate a kind of sacral status in the realm. And this blurring of the lines between secular and religious components of episcopal offices played a role in that. Nonetheless, the church would become very integral to administration, and this would become a deeply entrenched custom. Now, in the mid-11th century, late 11th century, especially with the accession of Pope Gregory VII, the cause of church reform reached its height in this period, the so-called Gregorian reforms, which were meant to root out simony, clerical marriage, and other things like that. While the papacy and the imperial office were, for the most part, allies before the accession of Gregory VII, in fact, the emperors had played a very large role in the removal of many of the noxious influences on the papacy in the 10th century, such as the various Roman noble families that would influence the elections and, put their own stooges on the papal throne. With the accession of Gregory VII, you had someone very, very devoted to the cause of church reform, and simultaneously you had a very stubborn emperor, Henry IV, on the imperial throne. So Henry IV needed to appear very strong in the face of disintegrating royal and imperial authority, and Gregory VII was rather uncompromising. So in 1076, Henry IV convened the German bishops at the Synod of Worms and renounced obedience to the Pope and demanded he resign, though they stopped short of deposing him, realizing they didn't really have the authority to do so. The proximate cause of this was that Pope Gregory VII had blocked the appointment in 1073 of a new bishop of Milan by Emperor Henry IV, on the basis that he had bought his position from the emperor. So Gregory VII retaliated in turn by deposing Henry IV, dissolving all oaths of allegiance to him in the empire, and excommunicating him. And this caused large-scale resistance to his authority and led many nobles to entrench themselves in their positions, building castles and hastening the feudalization discussed in my previous video. However, Henry IV managed to outmaneuver his opponents and cross the Alps, during winter no less, Gregory, at this time, was on his way across the Alps to meet the anti-royalist bishops and lords at Augsburg, but Henry managed to intercept him at Canossa, and appearing as a penitent outside of the castle of Canossa, clad in wool, barefoot in the snow, the Pope really had no choice but to lift the excommunication. He garnered tremendous sympathy and seemed truly repentant. However, this did a lot to damage Henry's prestige, and when he returned to Germany, the rebel lords elected their own. The first ever, in fact, anti-king in German history, Rudolf of Rheinfelden, who was the Duke of Swabia. Clearly, they were unmoved by the lifting of the excommunication, and the rebellion continued. They had been chafing, perhaps, under the authoritarian rule of the Salian dynasty, of which Henry IV was a part, and they just took the opportunity to entrench themselves in their own positions. So, the reforms went forward, many of them, and proclamations were made that lay investiture would no longer be allowed. But Henry IV asked that Pope Gregory VII condemn Rudolf, which led the Pope to excommunicate Henry IV again in 1080. Now, this was probably because Henry IV had said, hey, if you don't excommunicate and depose him, I'm going to appoint an anti-pope. And so Gregory VII naturally took this as something of a threat. And moreover, he heard that there had been a recent battle between Rudolf of Rheinfelden and Henry IV, and he had heard, more or less wrongly, that Rudolf of Rheinfelden had won. And so he decided to back that horse. Though, really, at this point, he had already alienated both candidates to a large extent because he had had such a non-committal attitude in the previous years. When Henry IV first asked to have Rudolf of Rheinfelden deposed and excommunicated, Pope Gregory VII kind of said, well, it's not really my place to get involved in that aspect of German politics, which is, understandably, Henry IV was rather upset at that. Now, continuing, Henry in 1080 assembled a synod declaring Gregory VII an anti-pope, and he declared him deposed, and he set up his own pope, an anti-pope, Clement III, in retaliation. The second excommunication of Henry IV was widely regarded as rather unjust, and it undermined a lot of Gregory VII's support. Now, Henry invaded Italy, and he even managed to be crowned as emperor by Clement III, anti-pope Clement III, and he would defeat Rudolf and two further anti-kings, and even his eldest son Conrad, who had become his co-king. Nonetheless, he was outmaneuvered by the papacy in Italy, thanks in no small part to Henry's awful reputation. For instance, he supposedly had treated his second wife very poorly, and also due to the papacy's major supporters in Italy, especially Matilda of Tuscany, who ruled a vast swath of land from Tuscany through the Romagna region up into South Tyrol, including the castle of Canossa, and the Normans in southern Italy, who were on the verge of founding the Kingdom of Sicily at this point. Eventually, Henry IV's second son, Henry V, would rebel against his father due to the failure of Henry IV's government. As I said, power started to rapidly dissolve in the empire, and not just in Italy, but in Germany. However, when he became sole ruler on Henry IV's death in 1106, he followed the same policy against the papacy as his father had, leading to continued squabbling with it until 1122, where you had the Concordat of Worms. Of course, by now, Gregory VII was long dead. Now, the terms of the agreement were as follows. The spiritual aspect of the investiture was to be conceded to the papacy, and this would be embodied by the bishop's staff, his robes, and ring. The German bishops were to be chosen in a manner that accorded with canon law. That is to say, they would be elected by the local cathedral chapters, or abbacies, and simony was to be forbidden. The emperor, however, was allowed to be present at elections, and he could adjudicate disputes between the candidates for these elections and present his own candidates. And he had the right to present the bishop with a scepter representing the bishop's secular powers, with a clause later being added that the secular powers were conditional upon an oath of loyalty to the emperor. Ultimately, the effect of the conflict was to accelerate the trend towards decentralization in the empire and to undermine the more authoritarian tendencies of the Salian monarchs, who practiced a style of monarchy that might be called a command monarchy, treating the duchies very much as appointed positions and removing people that they didn't like, often somewhat more arbitrarily than would later be the case. And it led to a government that was more based on consensus, the Holy Roman Empire as we know and love it, although it would be a while before it took its more modern form. Now, as for the church, the quality of the candidates for various church offices was improved. The corruption obviously continued. Simony was significantly curbed, and this did add a fair amount to the church's prestige. The emperors continued to be fairly involved. As I said, they could preside over elections and, arbitrate disputes between the candidates. Naturally, though, despite the fact that in principle the papacy claimed a kind of absolute authority over the church, this was limited in practice by difficulties of communication, and their ability to simply appoint the best candidate from a spiritual perspective would often be hampered by their own political interests. The papacy certainly had its own geopolitical goals. Now, while the Concordat of Worms provided a kind of temporary respite, it would be some time before the precise relationship between Pope and Emperor was fully ironed out. The Hohenstaufen dynasty, which dominated much of the 12th century and the early 13th century, certainly had its fair share of conflicts with the papacy, and I hope to cover that perhaps in my next video. One comment I would like to finish with, though, is that I think that this conflict between Pope and Emperor is part of what made Christendom great, in a way. Because in other societies, there is a tendency for spiritual power to become completely monopolized by and subordinated to the secular. And this causes priests and bishops and the like to become largely political figures, uninterested in the spiritual needs of their congregants. And that's not very good. And moreover, if they become fully subordinated to the secular power, then they'll often bend important religious truths in favor of the secular power. And on the other hand, I think it is good to have a kind of secular check on pure theocratic rule, because, to quote Pope Gelasius, the papacy shouldn't weigh down the secular arm with irrelevant considerations. There is an aspect of politics, there is a factual or scientific component to politics that is independent of the moral and spiritual spheres. And so, ultimately, I think this kind of tension is healthy for a state, because these are separate domains. So yeah, I hope this video was informative, and like I said, I would like my next video to perhaps cover Hohenstaufen conflicts with the papacy. If you have any questions, anything that was a bit confusing, please let me know. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys again in the future.